I'm going to be talking today about the responsibilities actually of both the universities and other training programs and professional associations with respect to creating the conditions necessary for high quality training and for appropriate practice in the field of psychology. I should point out to some of you who may not know this that or until recently, most training in clinical psychology for practice in psychology occurred in universities, but recently, since about 1970 or so, more and more of this training has been occurring in other venues, specifically freestanding schools, something like schools of chiropractic. I don't want to insult any of you who may be chiropractors, but these are schools that are not connected with universities and that do not have these long scholarly traditions that universities have. And so we have double problems here. The universities and similar organizations are responsible for the education and training of people in psychology, but our professional association, in particular the American Psychological Association, through its insistence on accreditation of training programs and thus the control of who goes into the field, how they get into it, and so forth, has arrogated to itself the responsibility for controlling training in clinical psychology without, I think, corresponding willingness to be responsible for the outcome of that training. Now, universities, I have a sense, maybe shouldn't be held responsible for the bad outcomes of their training. I'm not sure. I might have thought so at one time, but then I discovered that one of my own PhD students had been found guilty of malpractice for having sex with clients and giving drugs to clients and so on. And I began to have a diminished sense of responsibility for training at that time, and yet I do note that I, like universities, am very loath to give up the responsibility for good outcomes. I'm very proud of the students who have done well. I think we have to start moving in direction of broad acceptance of responsibility. Now, in fact, there's a legal case currently in the courts in Louisiana in which a university there is being sued for responsibility for the incompetence of one of its graduates, a person who got involved in malpractice in the mental health field and very serious, not only misfeasance but malfeasance. And the case was won at the level of the clinic for which this person worked and also a suit against the person, the clinician. But now the case has been carried on to sue the university for its potential responsibility, and the lawyer admits that this is an exploratory case to see how far the courts will go, but it's one that I assure you is being watched with considerable interest. Now, I apologize for these. I had a major computer malfunction. I usually print up my copies of my talk the evening before I'm to give it, and last night it malfunctioned and I had to do this by hand, but this is primum non nocere, which is said to be the first law of medicine as part of the Hippocratic Oath, and it means first do no harm. And that is a fundamental rule for the human service professions that should be taught everywhere. It should be ingrained into the psyches of our students, our trainees, and into clinicians, and should guide their practice. I think that is not being taught in psychology, not in a sufficiently explicit way, and not in a commanding way. Now the problem is that, and I don't have to tell any of you who are here, that in recovered memory therapy, harm is inevitable. There is no escaping it because the very occurrence of this is going to harm someone, at least if it is taken to the point of making public public charges, accusations, and so forth. It has been argued that this harm is deserved by the awful perpetrators of these events, and even if we granted that they were all perpetrators, nonetheless the harm is extended far beyond the perpetrators to many innocent persons. Many innocent persons, and as we saw in one of the talks the other day, the harm may be very extensive. For no other problem, including the field of criminal justice, do we permit the notion that it is ordinary or that it is regular and acceptable or even desirable to punish many, many innocent people, often severely, in order to be assured that we get the one person who may be guilty. Now, I emphasize that because I think that the harm is a critical issue in this. Now, in order then for that harm to be justified, even if we think that it is justified, it needs to be balanced by some positive outcomes. It needs to be balanced by doing some good, and the good that I would suppose to eventuate from recovered memory therapy should be happy, functioning, intact individuals who have been brought to that state through the therapy for their repressed abuse memories. Now, unfortunately, I think that is not occurring. I want to mention an anecdote, and I want to assure you that I do not believe that the plural of anecdote is data. And I'm using this simply to illustrate a point, but I happen to know someone personally who has been through recovered memory therapy, and we have a good many friends in common. It is common among the many friends to suspect that the events never happened in the first place, but it is also common to believe that she is not a better person. She is still difficult to get along with. She still has trouble with men. She still is procrastinating and finishing her dissertation, and so on. It is hard to discern the balance there that compensates for the fact that her family has been terribly wounded and she is apparently permanently estranged from them. Now, also, if this is true, if it is balanced, then there should be studies in the literature, scientific studies, to demonstrate that recovered memory therapy really does what it's supposed to do. This is a requirement that is being exacted in medicine. We can't get away in medical practice and other practice with simply claims or assumptions that therapy is effective. I have been looking in the scientific literature and the databases for evidence on the effectiveness of recovered memory therapy, and I find none. The assumptions are based on generalizations that I think are unwarranted from flawed studies on post-traumatic stress disorder, for which there's also no very persuasive studies, but also from the studies of the general effectiveness of psychotherapy, which is inappropriate. In the first place, some work that I and my students have been doing suggests that the effectiveness of psychotherapy is in general fairly small, and in general probably not enough anyway that most people dealing with persons who've had therapy will notice the difference. The general failure of therapy, however, doesn't cause so many concerns, because in general, when therapy doesn't work, the person who is affected by that is the person who's receiving the therapy, and no one else is arrested, humiliated, reviled, sued, ruined, and so on. Now, there is this dark side of psychotherapy that has been ignored generally in the healing professions, and that is that the evidence on the effectiveness of psychotherapy shows regularly that it is not invariably effective, that some people apparently are harmed, they are worse off from therapy. And this needs to be faced up to by the universities and professional associations, and we need to be able to account for that. Now, I'm going to show you another. I'm going to talk about something. I'll have to read this to you, I suppose, but I'm going to talk about the 5 basic laws of human stupidity. the first law of human stupidity is that always and inevitably everyone underestimates the number of stupid individuals in circulation. There are many more stupid people than we suppose, and I admit I'm using harsh language, and my mother wouldn't have approved of this, but she's not responsible for it. The second basic law of human stupidity is the probability that a certain person be stupid is independent of any other characteristic of that person. That is, stupidity is rather generously, unfortunately, and generally distributed. It's not the same as being dumb, as I'm going to show you. Dumb people are not necessarily stupid. Now, the third law of human stupidity is that a stupid person is a person who causes losses to another person while himself deriving no gain and even possibly incurring losses. And that is the fundamental definition of stupidity. That distinguishes it from other characteristics such as helplessness. Helplessness occurs when people manage to do things that are of no benefit to themselves or even harmful, but that do benefit other people. For example, one possibility would be the promise, "Yes, dear, of course we'll pay for your therapy." Now, it may be helpless. Intelligent behavior is doing things that help other people while helping oneself. For example, I would regard successful, if someone really is an effective psychotherapist, that is intelligent. It's an intelligent thing to do. It helps other people, and it helps the therapist make a living. Now, there's a third possibility, which is called banditry. And banditry involves hurting other people, but to one's own personal gain. There is, in the case of banditry, there is not actually a social loss necessarily. It's simply a transfer. The $100 still exists. It's just in different hands. And another possible example of banditry might be writing a paperback book that makes a lot of money and does a hell of a lot of harm. Now, the fourth possibility then is stupidity, which is doing things that are harmful to other people while not even helping oneself. And the stupidity is a very powerful behavior. Essentially, stupid people are dangerous and damaging because reasonable people find it difficult to imagine and understand unreasonable behavior. An intelligent person may understand the logic of a bandit. The bandit's actions follow a pattern of rationality. It may be nasty, but it's rational nonetheless. But in the case of stupid behavior, all of this understanding is impossible, as explained by the third basic law. A stupid creature will harass you for no reason, for no advantage, without any plan or scheme, and at the most improbable times and places. You have no rational way of telling if and when and how the stupid creature will attack. One is generally caught by surprise, and even when one becomes aware of the attack, one cannot organize a rational defense because the attack itself lacks any rational structure. Now, the reason I think that RMT is stupid behavior is that it has the potential and actually the inevitability of so much harm, and I think at no particular gain, and because it is really unnecessary from the standpoint of the therapist. That is to say, there really is no gain for the therapist. The person, the patient is already in therapy, is already paying, and will already stay in therapy if helped by the therapist. And so the therapist isn't gaining anything by this, nor is anyone else. All right, now with that, let me just go on. I may return to this. Our own organization, the American Psychological Association, issued an interim report on recovered memory and recovered memory therapies, and that was begun on, the commission was begun in February of 1993, and it took them until November of 1994 to release an interim report, which I think is something of an embarrassment. Among other things, it says that it's possible for memories of abuse to have been forgotten for a long time to be remembered. It says that the mechanism by which this occurs, this delayed recall occurs, is not very well understood. I think we could agree with that it's not very well understood, but to have labored for a year to come up with that, when in fact there's no evidence for it, which would have been evident in the beginning, is strange. It also says it's possible to construct convincing pseudo-memories for events that never occurred. The mechanisms by which these pseudo-memories occur are not currently well understood. I think that after our meeting here over the last 2 days, I think we understand very well why those pseudo-memories occur, and I think that it's unconscionable. I think that it's unconscionable of our professional association to suggest that we have no such knowledge. One of my colleagues, John Kihlstrom, who's a member of the advisory board for this group, has replied to this in an electronic network, 2 or 3 different networks, and it on November 25th, so this is fairly recent. I'd like just to quote from him briefly. He notes that most of the arguments in favor of RMT, he's an absolute world authority on memory and particularly on repression and the kinds of memories that are involved here. Most of the observations in favor of RMT are based on uncontrolled observations, anecdotal case reports, and inappropriate theoretical generalization. Proponents of RMT often point to animal and human studies showing emotional and non-emotional memories are processed by different brain structures, and none of that supports the claim that traumatic memories can be repressed and subsequently recovered. Proponents often rely on recently emerging literature on implicit memory, and he points out that that literature is also irrelevant and provides no basis for understanding any of this. Proponents of RMT often claim to find corroboration of recovered memories in the patients presenting symptoms. That also is inappropriate. It is not logically possible to infer a past event based on present symptoms. And then they often imply that recovery of traumatic memories is necessary for treatment to be successful, and there is no documentation whatsoever for that claim. Put bluntly, there is no good clinical evidence favoring the practice of RMT, but there does exist more than 100 years of experimental research on memory conducted in both laboratory and field settings that raises serious questions about this clinical practice. To dismiss this extensive body of research as irrelevant to clinical practice, as some opponents of RMT have done it in print, it is to express contempt for the scientific foundations on which professional psychology rests. And I agree quite well with John Kihlstrom on that point. I think that this attitude is contemptuous, and I think that it should be dismissed. Our professional association is not doing so. To give you another example of the outlook of our professional association, I've been involved in some controversies with them over the lack of scientific basis for work on continuing education. The fact that they advertise continuing education credits with no scientific database at all. And recently they wrote to me and said that as a result of my efforts, they were taking steps to correct this, that from now on, people offering continuing education would be, quotes, encouraged to provide the scientific basis for the efforts that they were going to engage in. That is, I am not encouraged. Our field has always had trouble with what I call the far side, the Gary Larson type far side of practice. Nude marathons, the Oregon box, alien abduction, and so forth. These have been, all of these activities have been engaged in by APA members, by licensed psychologists, by people sometimes who are prominent in the field, and all of those things were unsuccessful, were never dealt with by psychology. They were just sort of ignored, and some of those things make even RMT seem pretty reasonable. What psychology has done has been to pronounce some weak ethical principles, such as that practitioners should not practice beyond the limits of their own competence, but there's been no effort whatsoever to define competence or to instruct practitioners as to how they should recognize the limits of their own competence. And the idea of setting standards has been avoided altogether. Now, I'm interested here in the more general problem. I think RMT is interesting enough, but I'm interested in the more general problem of what we do when the next far side type therapy comes along and our inability to deal with it. Universities are involved in this, and they are complicitous because they've abandoned, if they ever absorbed, the scientific database. It's too constraining to practice. Science, practice should be constrained by science, but that isn't a very popular notion. Students are not trained in methodology very well at all anymore, even less well than they used to be, and especially measurement. They're not trained in critical thinking. For example, Robin mentioned Mark Twain's notion of the 13th chime of the clock. That's an example of critical thinking that's ignored. An instance of this is the fact that somehow or other all of these ludicrous charges of satanic practices and satanic torture and baby farms and so forth, one would think represents the 13th, 14th, or 15th chime of the clock, but that somehow seems to cast no doubt whatsoever on any of the other things that are associated with those kinds of recollections. The response to research findings such as those of Wakefield showing that families of RMT victims are really highly functional, that they are intact, well put together families, is simply dismissed on the grounds that, well, that shows that it can happen anywhere. And that kind of thinking we've got to do something about. Part of the problem is that we train our students in such a way that they rely for their information not on scientific journals, but on word of mouth, on paperback books, and so on. I'm being serious about this. There's also a clinical mystique that is involved here. It is much pleasanter somehow or other to believe for clinicians that they have a special personal characteristic, special insight, and a magic of sorts, rather than to think that, well, it's just what I've learned or that I have a lot of technical competence. Students are selected for sensitivity, but I've never heard of any student being selected for exquisite sensitivity to scientific data. We ought to start promoting that. Intuitions are trusted. Students are taught to trust their intuitions, and for an interesting way. Alexander Pope noted that treason never prospers, for if it prospers, none dare call it treason. Well, similarly, intuitions are never wrong. Intuitions are always right. Imagine if in your favorite mystery book, you read something like the following. As she entered the dark room, instinctively she knew she was not alone. Actually, she was wrong. No one else was there. Or his intuition told him that Paolo was going to be trouble, big trouble. But in fact, Paolo turned out to be a nice guy and very helpful. Well, those things simply do not occur, and those kinds of things. And so students are taught to rely on their intuitions and not to pay sufficient attention to the scientific database. Gustave Le Bon once commented how his years, I'm not sure the date of this quote, but his years were 1841 to 1931. How is it that our system of education, instead of merely being useless, is today manufacturing outcasts and rebels? And I'm wondering, how is it that our system of education today, instead of being merely useless, is turning out stupid, harmful people, actually? I want to conclude by saying that I think that professional societies and universities do have a lot of responsibility in these areas. I think that we should be held accountable, and although I hope personally that the lawsuit in Louisiana is not upheld. That is, I hope that they do not hold the university responsible for the act of one of its trainees. Nonetheless, I think that the suit itself may be clarifying and may get the attention of the profession, and maybe it should be tried in some other areas. I mentioned earlier the 5 basic laws of human stupidity, but I really only gave you 3. Let me give you the last 2. The 4th law is non-stupid people always underestimate the damaging power of stupid individuals. In particular, non-stupid people forget that at all times and places and under any circumstances to deal and or associate with stupid people always turns out to be a costly mistake. The 5th law of stupidity is a stupid person is the most dangerous type of person. And the corollary of this is a stupid person is more dangerous than a bandit. Thank you.